Well, we are at 12:30, and so welcome to Leadership at Lunchtime, Leading in the New Normal. Those of you who are familiar with our series will immediately recognize that I'm not Mike Grogin. Mike has taken a well-deserved break. I'm Jonathan Harvey. I lead the Leadership and Strategy Group in the Haslam College of Business, and it's my pleasure to sit in for Mike for this session. Today, we're going to be exploring the idea of how we begin to encourage a more strategic thought process as we settle into the new normal coming out of our crisis leadership, our challenging adaptations that we've had to build. So welcome, thank you for joining us. Please, as previously, if you have questions, forward those to Adam and Erica, and we will get to those as we move through our session. We're scheduled to run 30 minutes. We will run over a little bit if the questions are there, so please do stay with us if you can. It is my very great pleasure to welcome Mike Cates to the conversation today. Mike is Vice President and leads clinical and operational excellence for the St. Vincent Group of Hospitals, which is part of Ascension, one of the largest faith-based hospital groups in the country. And if anyone has insight into what leading through this situation of late has been like, and as we come out into the new realities from that, Mike is someone who can give us some really great thoughts and insights. So thank you, Mike, for joining us. I guess before we...
Real honor and pleasure to be with you today. Thank you for the ask.
No, you're very welcome. And I think even just before we kick off, I probably would like to kind of express just the thanks of a lot of people to the way in which our neighbours, friends and colleagues in the healthcare sector have been working so incredibly hard of late to support their communities and their people. And if the opportunity arises back at St. Vincent, please pass on our acknowledgements and thanks for that. It doesn't go unnoticed at all.
Thank you. I will. Yep.
And I guess that's probably not a bad place to start. I mean, we've had, and particularly in your context, 4 or 5 months of people so focused on a singular mission within the organization. As we kind of see a little bit of settling out and a little bit of a new normal establishing, how do we even get back to thinking a little more strategically and encouraging that strategic thought process?
Jonathan, great question, but let me kind of take you back. You know, this is COVID time, as I would call it. You know, 1 month seems like 10 years. So I received a call on a Saturday morning, just to give some context, in early March from one of my senior executive colleagues, basically sounding the alarm that we were ill prepared to handle COVID-19 as a healthcare system, and probably healthcare in general. So, you know, a call to arms, if you will. And as leaders, we really had to step back and take a few deep breaths and realize, for us, our organization, our team members, other leaders, our patients, we would have 3 generally really rough phases, and we didn't even know what rough was till we got into it. And this uncharted storm, and it's still uncharted in a lot of ways. You know, the first piece of that was triage. You know, then we had to begin to stabilize our operations and then really transform. And that's where strategy really comes into play. The first 5 or 6 weeks were extremely tough. You've all either seen the news, been in healthcare, some of you may work in healthcare. It's one of few industries that touches everybody at one time or another in many different ways. And it was tough on us to really try to triage the ever-changing situation and needs hour by hour. And that was a 5 or 6 week, hour by hour, you know, around the clock type thing. How to stabilize our operations, bring back surgical procedures that we had to cancel, at least in our state in Indiana, and other things back online. And then how do you begin to even approach transformation? You know, transformation infers, you know, really the cessation of something and the emergence of something new. The invention of the light bulb ended the era of the gas lamp, right? It transformed lives. COVID-19 has and will continue to utterly transform healthcare, and healthcare needs it. Let's just put that mildly. A small example for us of hundreds is telehealth. More legislation has been waived or passed in the last few months in telehealth than in the last 15 years. And if I look back, I looked at the numbers for us, in a quarter-on-quarter comparison, fiscal year 20 to fiscal year 19, we did more than 1,000 times the volume of virtual visits during that initial storm in the year prior. So just imagine the infrastructure response that we needed to have early on. And then try to imagine, which we couldn't at that time because we were immersed in it, what the opportunities in that one example strategically can bring to healthcare and our health systems moving forward. So that's just one of hundreds of opportunities and examples strategically. But to your question, Jonathan, to encourage more strategic thinking, this is just my personal opinion from my experience, leaders really have to internalize consciously the physiological and emotional aspects of this pandemic, regardless of industry, regardless of level that you're in the organization. So like most, moving from an initial adrenaline-oriented phase of constant action and then to a phase of maybe regression or a lull, if you will, in that initial action period, it's hard to do, but a time when real reflection needs to take place as a leader at all levels and regroup for that next action period, so to say. And I'm not referring to necessarily reaction to the COVID pandemic with regard to our healthcare system, but how to really look at the next action period of opportunities, the frontier, and so to say. So moving from a high tempo, to does that help stimulate some thoughts around your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Because it strikes me that if you look at the playbook for strategic thinking, there's lots about kind of, the adverse impacts that stress, pressure, fatigue, has on our abilities to do that and a willingness to engage. It strikes me that you may have an entire organization that is fatigued, emotionally, physically, that may be experiencing a degree of post-trauma in some cases. The idea of having a strategic thought process and a strategic conversation in that context seems a little absurd. How do we support our people so that they can engage in that?
To your point about PTS and or PTSD, prior to COVID, the literature would suggest that 40% of the nurse corps likely could be diagnosed with PTSD. That's pre-COVID, just in the general context of their daily work stresses, staffing levels, dealing with the emotional trauma of patients, 12-hour shifts. Nurses make up, depending on the health system, they're my heroes, roughly 80% of the workforce. So do the math on that context of now how to deal with an already and confoundedly exhausted, I would say fatigued in every aspect, fatigued workforce, to motivate, inspire, and bring them back onto an uncharted new world. So in that context, let me offer you some thoughts, maybe from an individual and organizational perspective. It took me a few months to realize this personally. It sounds so simple when I say it, but it took me months to figure it out. Individually, self-care is vital as a leader and for your teams. I thought I knew what that meant, but I didn't really. Let's put it that way. I spent, it's an estimated, and I know this because you have to fill out FEMA-related hours worked as you go through the disaster recovery process in healthcare. I spent 87 straight days operating, let's say as many of my colleagues did, working 14, 18-hour days. Yeah. So how do you move from a point of stabilization mode to really transformation mode in strategic mode personally as an individual leader. So I had to take some time away, honestly, just unplug the best I could. And through, I would say, various practical means, realized I needed to refresh, got as refreshed as I could, got back to a mindset of objectivity and more frontier opportunity thinking. You know, it's to put myself in that state of mind at a tempo that I realized I don't have to be, everything's not urgent and important 14, 18 hours a day right now, right? It will be, and things are important and urgent, but how to take myself out to take care of me so I can take care of others. It's really hard to take care of others and those that you're leading, not just through the organization, but your peers, right? And at times your leadership needs to be led, right? We all experience that. So that's the individual view I would offer to that. I think to be able to, as an individual leader, be more strategic in thinking. I can tell you from an organizational perspective, this was very difficult. Early on, when I talked about, triage, stabilization, and transformation, we knew we would have to get to that point, but how would we do that? So our leadership team took some time early on and identified some of our brightest and talented folks and pulled them out of work, pulled them out of any operational view, and built 5 work streams strategically. We're still in that period, but we took an initial 90-day period for that and repurposed them for that. So, putting them in a psychologically safe space, removing the stresses that they might have otherwise felt, pay continuation, those types of things, and working on everything from new capital structures that we would expect from CMS changes, the Center for Medicaid and Medicare reimbursement, private and commercial payer groups, your Anthems, Blue Cross Blue Shield of the world. We estimated prior to COVID, we had a pretty significant portion of our current facilities that were underutilized. And it's common in healthcare, right? We built a lot of facilities in healthcare nationally over decades. And so now, as you're all experiencing more virtual work, what does that mean from a capital structure perspective, repurposing facilities, et cetera? How do we strengthen our workforce? That's a huge one, right? We've in healthcare, we talk and do a lot of amazing work around patient experience. But, anecdotally, to get back to maybe the Southwest model or the Disney model, if you will, if you take care of your people first, they're going to take care of the customer, right? So really in a deliberate and conscious fashion, looking to innovate through programs and other things, how do we really strengthen the resolve and potential behavioral health or other aspects for our care team members? How do we deliver care in a less stressful way for folks? And then, lastly for us right now is doubling down on data analytics and informatics. So a tremendous amount of work going on there nationally for us within Ascension, and then also in our own state market, not just for the pandemic, but for as we evolve out of it. So hopefully many innovations and transformational items will evolve from these work streams and radically disrupt us for the better and how we deliver care. So we had to do that early on, be very conscious about, we don't know what it holds. We know we need to take care of ourselves and our team members, but let's isolate and insulate a core group of folks who can really help think through this and provide guidance and recommendations. Does that answer your question a bit?
I think that's really interesting, because what that seems to suggest is that even in the early stages of this, there was a recognition that we can't just be reacting to circumstances that are driving us, but we need to carve out a space to think about how do we actually think about and plan for what we're going to do in these circumstances. And that the way that was done, if I've understood what you've been saying, was to actually remove individuals from some of those frontline activities so that they can actually carve out some space to do that. It strikes me that in the midst of all of that, resource must have been a very, very valuable thing in terms of people and time. So to take people out of that must have been quite a bold decision to take. Was that something that, was recognized fairly early on, or did it take, was it a struggle?
It was recognized fairly early on. Our national and global leadership did a great job in my personal estimation, having been on several of the morning and daily calls as we were going through incident command and responding to the early phases of this, recognizing that and building those work streams out. Some folks still would have some time spent back in their quote unquote daily job, but for the most part had a good space to do that work. So very proud to serve in an organization that thinks that way and actually acts that way. And, we were able to, this is publicly reported information, but Ascension, nationally or globally, for that quarter period, we had a $2.7 billion loss. And, a lot of that was investment income. A lot of it was operating income. And to have the wherewithal to offer pay continuation to our folks that were furloughed, not doing any surgeries, and that's where the cash comes in a hospital system or a health system for the most part. To have that courage and ability, I think were very bold decisions. So proud to be part of a team that could and did do that. So, the reality is we still have a long way to go.
Right.
And a lot of things that we're still reflecting on, I'm sure, as most are.
Yeah, I mean, are you seeing a change in the leadership conversation at this point? I mean, is it the idea of saying, okay, the vehicle or the means by which we generate much of our cash flow and our income is completely suspended. We understand why. At some point, we want to start bringing all of that back on. At some point, the financial realities of our situation, become again a driver for our decision making. And then finding the space to be able to have those conversations when you still have that fatigue, that challenge within the organization, and some degree of uncertainty about, are we done? Is this a pause? Is it coming back? If so, when? How do we prepare for that?
It's interesting from, I spent, prior to coming into healthcare 4 years ago, maybe 18 years in some form or fashion of industrial global sales, finance, and distribution. And so taking a look at maybe from a demand capacity perspective and looking at the business, we had our governor, we worked very, very closely in the state of Indiana between what I'm very proud of personally and professionally. We call it the Indiana Pandemic Information Collaborative. And it's a joint group between who normally would be our competitors and other health systems, industry, academics, the Indiana State Department of Health, Family Social Services, and we've worked very diligently to bring guidance forward early on around our recovery plan as a state and, the stages of reopening, and then closely understanding the financial projections of elective surgeries when we could bring those back on. And we were prepared to do that 5-6 weeks ago. So when we review the financials on that, we're probably at 75%, maybe on a good week right now, 80% of the normal volumes.
Right.
But there is a fear pandemic out there, recessionary, right, of nationally the media, and no criticism of the media or governmental agencies, but we scared people away from being in the hospitals. And so there's a pent-up demand on, we've done more amputation surgeries than we normally would for diabetics who didn't seek care they should have and could have safely. Potential stroke victims that didn't seek care, cardiac patients who couldn't seek care. And so, we see those volumes coming back on, and that's good from a financial perspective and a business perspective. But then, I call it having one foot on the gas and one on the brake. We have to be very mindful and diligent to be prepared for oncoming surges. Flu season's coming up for us in healthcare in the fall. We don't know how this bug is going to act. If you look at the 1918, 1919 Spanish flu pandemic, the same spring, summer timeline. is a little scary. So there's no crystal ball on this. That's the first thing we had to realize. The model and the projections are just that. So we've really begun to have more deliberate discussions on being nimble, being organizationally capable and competent for change quickly. So I do believe we're resourced well to withstand, the demands on the health system. We've prepared with our state and competitors to research potentially, and at the same time, marketing. Our strategy and marketing teams have done a great job of getting the message out there that it's safe to come back in, that it's, we want to give you the care. It's a balancing act, but I don't know if that answers your question, Jonathan, but it's caused a lot more deliberate conversation.
I think that's fascinating, and I'm sure there's a whole other conversation we could have around that process of working with who would have been previous competitors, and maybe again in the future in a particular context because of need. And I think that's a really interesting kind of strategic decision, strategic thought process that could be further unpacked. I'm conscious of time, but I'm thinking perhaps we open it up and see what questions are coming through from the guys online. So Erica, Adam, do you have any questions for Mike?
Hi, Mike. This is Erica. I actually do have a question for you that came through. So the question is, what do you think the necessary conditions are, or the necessary conditions we would need in order for strategic thinking to be a routine part of organizations?
That's a great question. Thank you for whether you posed that, Erica, or someone else did via you. I think there are a few. One, I've always thought the simplest definition of strategy that I've heard is how to align resources to achieve goals. And if we can make it simple and understand that in a given period, the literature would suggest this too, that 2 to 3 strategic goals, anything more than that, you're likely not going to accomplish any of them. So having an environmental condition where leaders are unified, cultivating trust-based relationships. In the Danish company I used to work for, the motto was, it was an unofficial motto, but put the stinky fish on the table. You have to have the ability to put real issues on the table, have an environment that's not groupthink, mash out the best ideas with dignity and respect as you're working through those, but expect that lack of consensus to filter up the best ideas. I do believe, and the literature would suggest this too, that shared leadership in those areas is much more effective than vertical leadership. One person or a small handful of people don't have all the answers. So I do believe in shared leadership models with regard to those things. Hopefully that answers the question a bit. But
it's fascinating. It speaks to the connection to the culture of the organization, doesn't it? And how there are most definitely enabling cultures that assist in having those kinds of conversations, and certainly cultures that would discourage and preclude them. And there's been much written, much said, particularly about the Scandinavian approach to decision making, consensus-led leadership, the way in which you kind of broach those conversations. Some of it would be quite jarring to traditional hierarchical organizations. And I say that with all my British reserve.
Well, I laugh when you say that, having come from my time in the U.S. Army, which is very hierarchical, my time at GE at the time when Jack Welch was there early on, quite hierarchical, and that organization's changed dramatically over the years, to a culture for 12 to 15 years that was not that. It was actually very counter that. And it took me a while working for that business globally to understand the org chart is not really what you need to understand. It's the influencer chart.
Right.
And culturally, that leaders expect ideas to be brought forward, and if you're not doing that, then you're not leading. To translate that back into an American hierarchical system, I'll be honest, has been a bit of a challenge for me. But
some of our earlier discussions in these series has been how COVID has and the changes to the way in which people are working is actually really putting pressure on those traditional hierarchical authority-led models of leadership. And I think, there is perhaps hope as we emerge from this that, a more inclusive, more idea-led, more influence-led culture of leadership in organizations will actually embed and prevail. And clearly there are some great examples of those, are out there, but it perhaps isn't the norm. Adam, Erica, what other questions do we have?
Mike, this is Adam, and I received a question for you. So we talked in our last session about simplification, and I guess that is also relevant in a discussion of strategic thinking. How have you approached simplifying as a way of focusing strategic decisions in your role at Ascension?
Let me make sure I understand the question. If you could repeat the last part of it. How have I personally or the organization simplified? Just repeat the last part of it, please.
Yeah. So how have you approached simplifying as a way of focusing strategic decisions in your role at Ascension?
First, that's a great question. I really appreciate someone asking that. First is taking a long view. And I had the opportunity to learn that studying comparative health systems between Sweden, the UK, and the US. And if you look at, there's a great website, Hofstede Insights. You can look at that, but understand culture that exists by sovereign nations and other things. To take a long-term view rather than a reactionary, short-term, immediate-term view is a key in my mind to simplifying. Now, you have to be clever enough, and very few people can do this, but you got to be clever enough to deal with the immediate stuff in front of you on a daily, hourly basis, and also keep this long-term view. But if you can keep that long-term view, the infinite game, not the finite game, if you know anything about game theory, that simplifies down really your direction, right? From a 360-degree view of being all over the place to a directional focus, I think strategically. Where do you want to be positioned, for what reasons, what are the environmental characteristics and conditions you're dealing with within that, not being everything to everybody, if you will. I think the long-term view helps simplify that. And then helping others simplify by reiterating the top 2 to 3 things that you're focused on in that period strategically. It becomes your, the organization, all the ships have to sail in that direction. So, and strategically, that's not just the corporate governance body doing that. That is at every level, I believe. What does your department, your functional area that you're leading, or your division, how do you strategically fit within that larger strategy is very important. And so just to simplify it to the vital and important items, the rest to me is noise and communicating that, right? I hope that answers your question, but a long-term view, getting the ships to sail in the same direction through reiterating that, the more you cannot over communicate those key points strategically. I mean, it takes a while to get momentum and building to go down that path. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Mike. So I have another question for you. How do we have strategic conversations when the pace of operations is currently so intense? I'm
sorry, that just hit home, so I had to laugh. I'm hopefully laughing with you. on that one. It's back to that comment about being clever enough to deal with the immediate need of the daily operation and have that, view. There's a good book, and 4 Disciplines of Execution, if you've read it or familiar with it, but it in essence talks about, wildly insane goals, if you will, the WIGs, right? And this is harder to do than the book suggests, but it can be done. And organizations that do this, that constant churn, the storms, the daily stuff, hey, I just got a text, such and such order is going to be late, or we don't have this done on the day. Okay, that stuff's going to happen no matter what you do. Just acknowledge that. That's always going to be there, right? Period. It's never going to go away. But how do you carve out time, whether that's weekly or daily, or you pick the cadence for your particular industry, sector, team, and shut everything off. Just shut it off. It's not even allowed in the discussion. Phones are put away, as an example. We do this in some of our sessions where drop your phone on the bottom. It sounds simple. It's harder now virtually. But be present. That is so hard for people, to be present in the moment. And okay, I'm here in a strategic meeting trying to have this thought. Wait, my phone's texting me about a customer order or a customer complaint or a workplace issue with workplace vibe. You pick, right? That stuff's going to be there. Carve the time out. That's a conscious decision in leadership discipline that you have to instill in your culture. I don't know another way to do it, honestly. You have to make time for it.
And I think that's a really interesting point, Mike, because clearly it is a discipline, it is a practice, and that if you come to the idea of strategic thinking with the perspective that it's a kind of emergent thing that will just kind of happen, then I think the vast majority of us are going to struggle in that context. But by adopting a practice and a routine and a discipline around it, we at least start to carve out some space for that to stand a chance.
In my prior employment, what I really enjoyed about the company Grundfos out of Denmark was we had a global strategy, and we spent months with the top 50 or 100 folks coming back and forth to Denmark to understand our markets globally. And within that guidance of the strategy, the 5 things we were going to focus on, from customer service to new product development, you get on the list, right? How does your business or division globally fit into that? And so understanding, if you're in a parent, kind of parent-child organization, if you will, or even in a mid-sized, a startup type business, understanding that you have to practice that, actually make time for it, and understand how your team or your division's strategy actually fits into a larger one, or does it not, right? You may be setting, I don't know all of you on the call, but you may be setting that tone yourself as a leader for a smaller, more entrepreneurial business. You got to have the courage and discipline to do that, and trust the people you've brought in around you. And hopefully you're bringing good people around you. In a larger organization, if it's not happening, lobby for it. make the point to do that. So.
Thanks, Mike. I've got another question for you. Has the experience of COVID actually increased the organization's willingness to engage in more diverse strategic thinking? And are you able to advance ideas that would have been impossible pre-COVID? It
has been a forcing function. I received an email as a joke from someone that I don't know if it was funny or not at the time, but it was, what has disrupted and transformed your healthcare organization? CEO, C-suite, C-19, COVID. And it has been a forcing function to drive more frequent and more rapidly discerned ideas in a strategic space, if you will, at least in my opinion. What was the latter part of that question? It was a two-parter.
So the second part of the question was, are you able to advance ideas that would have been impossible pre-COVID?
Yes, both internally and externally. I gave the example of telehealth. For example, I was very surprised. This is more a phenomenon, internally and externally, that there are some specialties, whether neuroscience, cardiology, you go down the list, who I wouldn't say have been completely averse, but never really wanted to trial telehealth or virtual visits, had to see people in. That culture has really changed. They actually like it. COVID has the environmental characteristics of it have really driven people to test things they otherwise might not have. No matter how much you lobbied or taught or brought evidence to the forefront, it's been a real forcing function for that. And I think we've learned through that probably a more collective openness and willingness to listen to science and to try things in more of a, I want to call it a plan, do, check, act cycle, but bring an idea to the table in an agile methodology way, create a minimally viable product or service, see if it works or not. Does it? Yeah, let's scale it. If it doesn't, thanks for trying and failing. Those are concepts that are maybe fairly common in a lot of other industries that healthcare is really just getting its arms around the last, 18, 24 months. So short answer.
Do you think that's because of the very strong and rightly so safety kind of orientation that exists within healthcare for lots of good reasons? That the idea of experimentation is something that happens elsewhere before we do it. That also almost institutionally ingrained.
Yeah, very much so. I've had a lot of discussions with our chief clinical officers around this and other, non-clinical executives. You got to think too in healthcare, to your point, Jonathan, that clinicians are taught, if you fail, somebody might die. So we're not going to do anything as best we can that's not evidence-based practice that's gone through clinical trials and been proved and by regulatory authorities. So that mindset is taught and bred early on, and that is a culture. So to understand operationally, not necessarily clinically, but operationally, that it is okay to fail. It is okay to try and experiment in a controlled way. That has been a hump to overcome, and we're overcoming it through success and innovations. But I can tell you the COVID response has really amplified that need and willingness to do so.
Well, it provides a very real burning platform.
Hi, Mike. So I have another question for you. Can encouraging a more strategic thought process actually assist in supporting our people as we emerge from the COVID crisis?
I think it has to. Could you repeat the question for me? It was a little garbled on my phone. I'm sorry.
Yeah, sure thing. Do you think encouraging a more strategic thought process can actually assist in supporting our people as we emerge from the COVID crisis?
Yeah, thank you. I thought I heard it that way. It has to. You have to encourage it. And I'll tell you, at least in my opinion, why. I once heard a very simple definition of leadership, and it was, if you're followed, you're a leader. And followership requires trust. It requires belief. And if a leader is not encouraging strategic thinking at every level, I would find it hard to want to follow someone personally. I would find it very difficult to believe that there's a black box that exists somewhere that everybody else or somebody else has got complete control over, and I should just be comfortable with that. That's not my DNA and makeup, so I do encourage that. And I think as organizations emerging, back to business, and so many so many industries have a different temporal aspect to this pandemic and the things associated with it. You know, oil and gas is much different than healthcare temporally in terms of recovery to, you know, the technology sector, to whatever business you're in. But imagine your organization if you're not encouraging strategic thinking. You have to. And so the ways to do that are through, you know, structures, the discipline, practicing it, getting better at it, learning from what you implement operationally from that strategy, and being willing and capable to pivot from it. You know, that is vital, to accept failure and go, okay, we're not going to make that mistake again, but we tried it, and how does that impact our strategy, or does it at all? You know, that would be my reactionary answer. I could probably give a better one if I thoughtfully reflected on that question. But
Mike, I'm reminded of the conversation we had the other day, and how we spoke that when in the middle of the COVID kind of maelstrom that was going on, the idea of having leaders who can at least point to a point in the future that's after this, you know, can have such a strong impact on the team and the organization. I think, you know, as we think about encouraging that strategic thought, part of it is, you know, even if we don't have all the answers, if we have a sense of where, you know, something the other side of this, something that's going to emerge from this, something that we can actually build and take a little bit of control over after this, can act as a strong support to our teams. Is that something you saw in practice?
Wow, that's a really deep question, Jonathan. The answer was yes. I don't know that it was conscious at the time,
Right.
On a collective basis.
Yeah.
I think there's an intuition, you know, individually and collectively as leaders, that, you know, there's another side of this storm. You will swim through the waves. Will you reach South America, or will you end up in Florida and discover America? Who knows? But at least you'll be on land. And you know, the psychological reassurance for folks that together we'll get through this, together we will, I mean, it sounds cliche, but it's the truth. People need to feel and internally feel confident and comforted that you are, as a leader, you know, in it with them, so to say. You're not leading from behind. And to just create that psychologically safe space that people can decompress, to then be encouraged, to be thought partners, and know that you are listening and engaged as a leader. It sounds a little cliche, but doing it is so important. I don't know if that hits on your theme there, Jonathan.
It does. And I think it goes back to, you know, the point we made earlier around, you know, the decision that your organization took to take people out of the situation, to provide us with some perspective and some insight and some strategic, you know, thought around how we deal with it, whilst others were in the kind of very much the operational phase of managing what was going on. I'm conscious of time. Adam, Erica, do we have any final questions?
We've got one more question. Mike, the final question is, what advice would you have for a leader trying to get more strategic thought from their teams?
Trying to get more strategic thoughts from their team?
Yes.
Was that the question?
Yep.
I'll be very practical about it, in the perspective of coming from your team. Create the space, create the expectation. If folks aren't comfortable, understand why they're not comfortable. Is it because they feel like they have imposter syndrome, and if asked to be strategic, they don't know how to be, right? There may be some education with that. There may be some development with that. There may be some role modeling with that. But give them the space, make the space, and the expectation to have strategic discussions. You know, it's like anything else. You know, wherever you are on your maturity journey as an organization or department or team or division, there's necessarily no right or wrong. It's about getting started and doing it. So, you know, I came from the automotive world, you know, years ago, and Toyota's journey to excellence didn't happen overnight. They're 75 plus years into what they're doing in their culture. So I would say, just if you haven't, get started, create the space, the expectation, role model it, pull on people. You know, you have networks of trusted folks that do those things pretty well. You know, find out what's working and not working for them. That would be my practical answer. I hope that helps.
I'm sure, yes, it does. Mike, I think we're running out of time. It's been a real pleasure to kind of chat with you on these themes, explore back and forth. I will personally look forward to reconnecting again soon and picking up some of these ideas and conversations. But for now, Mike, thank you so much for taking some time out of your extraordinarily busy schedule to spend some time with us. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you to all those that dialed in, and hopefully it was helpful. Happy to follow up with you, Jonathan, and the university if there are other questions that people have. But thank you for the time, and thank you for all you're doing. The world needs leaders, needs good leaders. So go forth, onwards and upwards.
Thank you, Mike. To those of you still online, we'll look forward to reconnecting with you in 2 weeks' time, when Mike Grogin will be back in his usual chair. But for now, from us at the University of Tennessee, thanks, and we will speak to you soon. All the very best.